Hey everybody, Andy Cavernan here with another Cornerstone Connection Daily Devotional. Hey, have you ever been online or maybe in a conversation with a group of people and something was said that you thought, ooh, I think maybe that should have been said in private, not in this public arena? I was online recently and saw a Facebook conversation where that was just such a case. Somebody had linked to an article that had some theological proposition about what we might term as a secondary issue, something that's not a matter of first importance, like it talks about in 1 Corinthians 15, an issue about which theologians have differed for a long time, good, well-meaning, godly, Bible-believing theologians. But one person really disparaged the article, disparaged the person, in essence, that was advancing the article, and I thought, man, I wish that would have been done in private. It reminds me of a story in Acts chapter 18 where there are three characters involved. Paul has come alongside Priscilla and Aquila, and these are tent makers, the kindred spirits with Paul, people who actually built tents in the first century for their profession, but who had come to faith in Jesus and with whom Paul spent quite a lot of time and apparently had rubbed off on quite a bit, so much so that Paul brought them with him on one of his missionary journeys. And he brought them with him all the way to Ephesus, where he left them in sort of a caretaking role for the church in Ephesus while he went on to Antioch. And the exchange here is between Priscilla and Aquila and a new person who's just come to town into Ephesus and who's preaching the gospel, who's preaching about Jesus. But what's interesting is that as Apollos comes to town, that's the name of this gentleman, he's preaching the gospel, he's knowledgeable about Jesus, but he doesn't have the whole thing in mind. And so I want you to pick it up with me here in Acts chapter 18, starting in verse 24. It says this, it says, "Meanwhile, a Jew named Apollos, a native of Alexandria, came to Ephesus. He was a learned man with a thorough knowledge of the Scriptures." Okay, so Apollos is smart. He knows the Word. He knows the Scriptures. And then it says, verse 25, "He'd been instructed in the way of the Lord, and he spoke with great fervor and taught about Jesus accurately, though he knew only the baptism of John." So Apollos knew the way of Jesus, but he didn't know it completely. He only knew about the baptism of John. He didn't have a full understanding of the gospel. Now, when somebody comes along into a church that's been established, a church like Ephesus, the tendency would be to say, if they're not doing it right, to sort of call them out publicly and say, get away from here. But it's fascinating what happens next. And again, Priscilla and Aquila are the ones sort of caretaking over the church in Ephesus at this time. It says this about Apollos: "He began to speak boldly in the synagogue. When Priscilla and Aquila heard him, they invited him to their home and explained to him the way of God more adequately." When Priscilla and Aquila heard him, they didn't stand up in the synagogue and refute him immediately. They didn't choose a bullhorn. They didn't go to the most public of spaces, Facebook, to call out sort of the inadequate teaching of Apollos. No, they invited him over. They had a private conversation. No doubt they affirmed Apollos and the things that he knew about the Lord. But then they instructed him, hey, there's more to it than what you've been teaching. Let us show you. And so they did. Now, it follows in verse 27 with this: "When Apollos wanted to go to Achaia, and the brothers and sisters encouraged him and wrote to the disciples there to welcome him. And when he arrived, he was a great help to those who by grace had believed." The result of Priscilla and Aquila taking time to come alongside Apollos and say, hey, let us help you grow in your understanding, grow in your application of the gospel, was that Apollos was a great help in the kingdom of God. I wonder how often, when we choose the wrong place and the wrong time, perhaps to rebuke somebody who we disagree with, perhaps to ridicule them, to call them out, how often do we keep somebody from being useful for the kingdom, to being very useful and a great help to those who had believed? Friends, let's be careful with our words and be careful with the context in which we engage in some of these conversations. Maybe face Facebook, maybe Instagram, maybe Snapchat or whatever it is isn't the place. Maybe there's a better way. Let's be willing to do as a Priscilla and Aquila, to go in private and to have a conversation, and may the kingdom be advanced because of it. God bless you, friends.